Reverse engineering Nintendo. Tengen had a big problem in manufacturing Nintendo game cartridges. The NES security chip. Atari and Tengen engineers pored over the NES console and retail cartridges. They disassembled everything. They read chip outputs on oscilloscopes. They modified existing retail cartridges to see how they worked. A quick development hack was to open a retail game cartridge and remove the game ROM chips and replace them with a socketed new game ROM so you could hot swap them out. But using a hack socketed retail NES game while allowing programmers to burn and test games was not something you could sell to a consumer. The retail cartridge had to pass NES security chips. We could develop games using ramulators, all sorts of tools, in-circuit emulators. These are all technology things, but we couldn't ship a game even if we could make it. No matter how hard and how long Atari and Tengen engineers tried, no one could replicate Nintendo's pseudo-random number sequence. It seemed to morph and change. It did not seem to behave like pseudo-random numbers that we were expecting. But computers cannot be random. They are yes or no. They are on or off. They are true or false. They cannot choose to go left or right. They will go left when instructed or right when instructed. They will not do anything else, nor will they do anything at all until instructed to do something. Computers are tools. Well, that is all until AI directs those tools to do something under their own direction. That is a whole nother discussion. So, the engineering efforts at Atari were failing in figuring out how to emulate the NES console's security lockout number system. The Atari chief lawyer had an idea. He visited the US Patent Office with an engineer, Mark Phoenix, who examined the filed patent with the attorney. Mark was a very smart guy, and he knew immediately what he was looking at: the pseudo-number random generator operators and operands. In other words, Mark had their code and algorithm with its constants. Mark wrote some of the information I understand on his hand before they left the patent office. He was able to transcribe it later and develop a comparable algorithm and code that successfully simulated the NES security chip without using their exact code or algorithm. Atari Tengen had successfully reverse engineered the NES security, and they could bypass it, albeit with a little help from the patent office. Atari Tengen created their own custom NES security chip with firmware. They called it Rambo, named after the movie that reflected their feelings against Nintendo. Rambo mimicked the NES security chip handshake and number sequence and replicated the NES multi-memory controller MMC so they could support huge game ROMs just like Nintendo, and it would support persistent saved games. Rambo completely bypassed every Nintendo security system. But there was a catch. Atari could not let any developer who had ever worked with Nintendo work with anyone in Atari Games or Tengen. And if anyone somehow already had contact with NES developers or hardware or software or documentation or anything, they must isolate themselves from Atari Tengen people that were working on Nintendo. Tengen became its own company with its own security, although it did remain within Atari's building. Tengen had to be a clean room, which legally meant the entire company staff had to be isolated from the outside world, such that they could not be exposed to Nintendo's intellectual property or trade secrets. As an interesting point, I qualified as a clean room developer for the NES, even though I had worked already on contracts and shipped NES games like Cyberball. I qualified because I used sculptured software's allegedly reverse-engineered technology and docks, which were similar to EA's allegedly reverse-engineered NES tech and docks. But because they had them, I therefore was not disqualified. Indeed, I knew everything about the Nintendo, and yet I was clean because I had middleware or intermediary parties that I could have learned from. Tengen became a renowned underdog against Nintendo and its oppressive licensing program. through its manufacturing and distribution NES game royalty system. Nintendo could not let that stand, both from a revenue perspective but also from a flock following perspective. If the sheep companies saw Tengen not pay, they might revolt and follow suit. So Nintendo fought back hard. Nintendo sued with impunity any company and individual that dared defy their manufacturing, security, and distribution payment program. Atari and Tengen and Time Warner, which owned part of Atari at the time, were all sued by Nintendo. Employees were given pirate hats to wear, representing the culture of defiance against the empire of Nintendo. Later, construction hats were handed out, with stickers showing circle slash over Nintendo. Everyone talked about the lawsuit and how, if we did not win, it would be the end of Tengen and Atari games, and freedom in making games. The lawsuit raged for years, and Atari lost. But Tengen did not die as prophesized. Its vice president, Steve Calfee, used the years during litigation to pivot the division to Sega entirely. As Sony was moving into the market, it was another target. Although there are always legends of the ET game cartridges buried away, I personally did not witness any of that. However, I did witness the original Tengen Tetris locked away in massive steel cages while the Tengen Nintendo lawsuit raged on. Tengen Tetris used Atari Tengen's custom-created chip and firmware called Rambo, again after that movie, for its independent righteousness. Rambo mimicked the NES security chip handshake and its security system. It replicated its memory system for allowing large cartridges to be used in the NES game console. Eventually, Atari Tengen was merged with Time Warner Interactive Group and was rebranded as Time Warner Interactive. There was no more Atari Consumer. Atari's executive staff would hold coin-op up as the hallmark of what Atari was and would always be. And Atari died, with the executives extolling its grandeur as Atari coin-op, despite the fact that it had become an albatross around the neck of its consumer division. Many years later, it was surprising that during Atari's final shutdown, auditors rummaged through its many poorly cataloged receipts and assets, and they found that Atari had a warehouse in Milpitas, fully owned, no one knew about. Much like people, when companies die, their skeletons and oddities come out for everyone to see. Atari was no exception. It would turn out that someone in old Atari thought that the company had far too much money to invest in any one thing. And so they had decided Atari should buy a fleet of Rolls-Royce limousines and store them in a warehouse for future resale. The cars were covered and in mint condition. That is one weird story, but it underscores the lavish lifestyle of Atari games and how the culture was completely disconnected from the rest of the world's reality. I was very fortunate to have worked for Atari Games.